Hello and welcome back to Jimbo's PC Builds. Today I'm going to do a build covering the Ryzen 5 1600 and motherboard combo that I bought at a bargain price from Micro Center. I'm going to combine it with several components that I've picked up over time, but the highlights of these are going to be a Samsung 860 Evo and a Power Color RX 580. Which is a combo in terms of the SSD, which should help the system run very effectively, and the graphics card combined with the processor and motherboard should give really good graphics performance. Being a first generation Ryzen part, it's not really worth combining it with a super fast modern graphics card, although in some games that are not CPU intensive it will perform well, but in anything that does run reasonably fast, it may bottleneck the graphics card somewhat. But for 1080p ultra quality gaming, this graphics card combined with the CPU will take care of any modern game. So with that said, let's get to some B-roll about the build, and after the B-roll I will give you the thoughts on the build itself and any conclusions I can give in terms of how easy it was to put together and what you should be looking for in terms of maybe anything else to combine with the CPU and motherboard.
We're going to have the opportunity to have a really good look at what you need to do when installing a CPU, memory and CPU cooler into the motherboard. We're also going to cover how to install the NVMe drive that I mentioned earlier. Firstly, you have to remove, when installing the AMD stock cooler, the brackets that come with that some CPU coolers do attach to. The AMD one that comes with it, however, does not. So you have to remove the 4 screws, then you take the brackets off. Once the brackets are off, you can then install the CPU. First of all, raise the lever. Secondly, take the CPU out of its packet and place it into the socket as I've mentioned before, making sure that the corner with the dot on is lined up with the dot on the motherboard. Next, stick your sticks of RAM in, making sure you're sticking them in the relevant channels to take advantage of the dual memory. Always make sure you press them firmly in, but not too firmly, ensuring that you hear the audible click and the arms on both sticks will be firmly in place. Next, stick the cooler on. Make sure you line it up with the screw holes properly. If you're using the cooling solutions on the bottom of the cooler, make sure you try and not wiggle it around too much, because there's a good amount of it on the bottom of the cooler and it can move around. Firmly press the cooler down and then screw each screw in individually. When you're doing it like this on top of the motherboard box, the bracket underneath can move around, so make sure you get in firm contact with the screws when pulling it in. Just make sure you don't do it too tight, because you don't want to press the cooler too hard against the CPU and damage it. But once it's done, make sure it doesn't come off, and then plug in the fan on top of the cooler. Next, we're going to stick the NVMe drive in. Take it out of its... first we need to take it the screw out that's in there. On most motherboards that come out of the box, there's a screw already attached to the motherboard, so you need to take it out of the motherboard first. Try and keep the screw on the end of the screwdriver if it's magnetic, because it's very small and you don't want to lose it. Then you take the NVMe out of its packet, and then when you're sliding it in, you need to keep the label up like so and then insert it. You'll notice there's a notch on the end of the drive, and there's also a little notch on the motherboard. Line those up and then press the NVMe drive in pretty carefully. You don't want to press too hard again. Once it's in, you'll know it's ready because it's kind of leaning up. Press gently on it, and the screw you took out before, put in place gently and slowly, and then again tighten it up, but don't go too tightly because you don't want to screw things up. Once you've done that, then we're going to put the IO shield on. Now, I mentioned previously in the last build video that I did, you just push it in and then you can hear audible clicks when you're pushing it in. Nice and firm. bring the motherboard in. When you're trying to put it in, make sure all the I/O line up to the holes on the shield, push the I/O through, and then make sure the motherboard's nicely in place. There you go. And then you have to screw in each individual screw to attach it. When I did this, I attached the SATA drive to the back like I did with previous builds. Once you pass the cable through, plug it into the SATA hole. I did this before the GPU because the GPU slides in over where the SATA drive attaches. When you bring the GPU in, line it up to the PCIe slot, press it in slowly until you hear the audible click when it's in place.
The final result is pretty attractive. The RGB fans add that little bit of je ne sais quoi to an ordinary build otherwise. With a glass panel on, it will give that right level of tint of privacy to the actual rest of the parts. The RX 580 does not have lighting but is black and adds to the overall colour scheme of the build. The memory, which has got the metal effect, looks really nice also. The stock cooler that comes with the AMD doesn't really add to the aesthetics, but the performance you'll get from the Ryzen 5 1600 combined with the memory and the RX 580 more than make up for the lack of aesthetics. So as you can see from the build footage, the slight difference between this and say the beginner's build was the NVMe hard drive, which went straight into the motherboard. Hopefully you were able to see the subtle difference between that, and also I was able to get closer with the camera to the motherboard and processor when I was putting in the likes of memory as well. So I hope you found that informative. I didn't do a full breakdown for this video because pretty much everything I did apart from the NVMe drive was covered in the previous video. One thing I would say that I found a bit of a challenge with the motherboard that came with the deal was because it was micro ATX and it was a certain type of micro ATX. It only had one chassis fan header, which meant that I had to really stretch to try and join the three fans that I put in, because I put some RGB fans in, as you can tell from the video, in there, and so I had to try and work the cable all the way across the motherboard, which wasn't very attractive. Unfortunately as well, and you may have noticed from the final build B-roll footage that the motherboard is actually different in the final build. I'm not sure how it happened, and these things do happen, and I mentioned about earthing yourself in the first video, but nothing's ever perfect. And to be fair, at some points I wasn't earthed, and it's probably when it happened. I managed to blow the motherboard, the original motherboard, so I've had to actually replace it with a Gigabyte Aorus motherboard, which gave me certain advantages. Well, the main disadvantage was it was slightly more expensive because I had to buy it outside the combo because it's just the way it is. But the advantage is it had more than one chassis motherboard header, and they were towards the edge of the board, which meant it was much neater. The other problem that I had with the build, I had to put the fan header, which came with the three fans for controlling the light effects, etc. Originally I tried to put it behind the motherboard, but then the actual case I had didn't close. Okay, so that's pretty much the conclusion. I hope you find the build interesting. Come back for future content. Remember to hit the thumbs up if you found the video entertaining. Hit the thumbs down if you didn't, and either way, do provide comments. They're essential for improving these types of videos and any future content. Please remember to subscribe, and remember to take care.